You know what I find so strange? A child can lose their childhood and people call it impressive, not because they became happier, not because they became healthier, but simply because they became easier to admire, easier to rely on, easier to consume and tolerate. And I think one of the most clearest examples of that is the phrase, "You're so mature for your age." Maturity by definition is supposed to mean emotional regulation, discernment, responsibility, self-awareness, stability, and even good judgment as well. But somewhere along the way, society started confusing trauma responses with maturity. Silence becomes maturity, hyper-independence becomes maturity, emotional suppression becomes maturity, children carrying adult emotional burdens become maturity. And I personally think that's one of the most dangerous things we have normalized among many things. Hey, my name is Sunshine. This is my channel and I talk about culture, identity, beauty. Please leave a comment. Let me know if you've experienced or even heard that compliment before. Compliment, and we can talk about it in the comment section, because I genuinely think almost every woman has heard this phrase before. You're so mature for your age. When you're 15, 16, 17, it sounds like praise. It literally sounds so sophisticated. It's almost like you've unlocked adulthood early, like you're smarter than your peers, more emotionally advanced, more understanding. And I think that's why so many young girls link to it, because adulthood honestly looks powerful from a very far distance, very far. But the older I get, the more I realize a lot of what gets labeled as maturity in children actually isn't maturity at all. It's adapting, it's performing, it's survival. You literally adapt to your environment. A lot of mature children are just children who learn very early that being emotionally convenient gets rewarded. Think about it for a second. The child who doesn't react emotionally gets called mature. The child who suppresses their needs, who doesn't always question things, who doesn't question things at all, who learns how to emotionally manage adults around them, always gets praised. And after hearing that enough times, you start associating self-suppression with value. You start believing, if I am easy, people will love me. And that follows people deep into adulthood, because a lot of children who were called mature grow into adults who struggle asking for help, feels guilty resting, overfunction emotionally in relationships, become everybody's therapist, and confuse being needed with being loved. We struggle setting boundaries, feel responsible for fixing everybody else's emotions. And the scary part is people raise them the entire way through it. Studies on something called parentification, I don't know if I pronounced that wrong, forgive me, but where children are pushed into emotional caregiving or adult responsibilities way too early. It shows this link to anxiety, depression, emotional exhaustion, difficulties forming healthy attachments, and chronic people-pleasing later in life. And one of the saddest part is that these children are often described as wise beyond their years, which honestly sounds beautiful. When you're young, that's like so amazing. An older person's telling me that, until you realize wisdom gained too early often comes from survival, not safety, not freedom, simply survival. And I think Black girls especially experience this in a very particular way. There's this pressure to be resilient early, strong early, emotionally composed early, to skip softness, to skip our innocence. Even studies have shown Black girls are often perceived as older than they actually are, and are often given less protection and nurturing compared to their peers. Honestly, you can see this dynamic everywhere in media. For example, we have Euphoria, which I know they've released a new season, but these are technically teenagers navigating incredibly adult emotional situations while still trying to figure out who they are. Or let's look at The Hate U Give. Star has to emotionally navigate racism, identity, grief, code switching, fear, and survival while still being a child herself. Then don't forget Precious. The entire film is about what happens when childhood gets replaced with survival mode. We saw this in the mother and the daughter. And I think one of the reasons these stories resonate so deeply is because a lot of people don't realize how common emotional overdevelopment actually is, especially in girls, especially in children who grew up in unstable environments, especially in children who were rewarded for being emotionally useful instead of emotionally safe. And I honestly think books from Black authors explain this beautifully too. Bell Hooks talks a lot about how girls are often taught to deny themselves in order to care for others. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eyes is literally about what happens when a young girl internalizes harmful projection before she even understands herself properly. Maya Angelou also writes so powerfully about how we convey innocence in growing up too fast. And I think one of the biggest consequences of being mature for your age is grief. Not immediate grief, but delayed grief. The kind that hits you later on as you age. Maybe in your 20s, maybe even in your 30s, to be honest. When you suddenly realize that I never actually got to just be young. I've realized that many times where I'm like, I've always had to be an adult. You were always understanding, always managing, always observing, always emotionally adjusting yourself for other people. And then adulthood just comes out of nowhere and everyone expects you to continue carrying that same emotional weight forever. And honestly, I think that's why there's so many formally mature children burn out later in life, because eventually the nervous system collects its debt. And I think think this is also why older women can sometimes sound protective when talking to younger girls, not because they think young women are stupid. I don't think that, but because they remember what it felt like to mistake validation for respect, to mistake attention for care, to think being chosen meant being valued. And I really want to know what people think about this, because I genuinely believe this conversation should be talked about more, and it's bigger than people realize. Have you ever been called mature for your age? And looking back now, do you think it was actually a compliment? Because I don't think it was a compliment. Or do you think it made you abandon parts of yourself early?
And I think there's another side of this conversation that doesn't get spoken about enough, because sometimes you're so mature for your age is not always a compliment. Sometimes it is a form of reframing, a way of softening something that should never be softened. Because in a lot of real world cases, especially in the grooming dynamics, the language used is rarely direct. It is suggestive. It is carefully chosen to make something inappropriate feel acceptable. So instead of clear intent, you get statements like, oh, you're different from other girls your age, or you're very mature, or you understand things adults don't, or like you're basically grown anyway. And over time, those statements start to reshape how a child is seen, not just by the person saying them, but sometimes by the environment around them as well. Because once a child is labeled as mature, something subtle starts to happen. People begin to relax their guard, not because the child has changed in any form or way or manner, but because perception has been shifted, and that shift can have real consequences. In family systems and close community, this is often where safeguarding weakens. The adult who's always around but never questioned, the uncle, and we all know an uncle who's treated as harmless because he's familiar, and sometimes he's not treated as harmless because everyone knows his behavior but it's ignored. We have the older cousin who's given access without oversight, the family friend who's always allowed to be close simply because they belong to the extended environment. Sometimes people notice small things, sometimes they even joke about them, but the label of mature can create a kind of social blind spot where concerns is softened into normal behavior, and boundaries that should be firm begin to loosen. And to be clear, this is not a gender issue. Women can also be predators of sexual abuse. Aunties, teachers, caregivers, older family friends. Abuse is not defined by gender. It is defined by access, trust, and opportunity. And when a child is seen as older than they are, that access becomes easier to justify. This is where the data becomes really important, because this is not a rare or isolated issue. According to UNICEF, forgive me for the pronunciation, but UNICEF 2024 Global estimates more than 317 million girls and women worldwide have experienced rape or sexual assault before the age of 18. That number is not a marginal number. That is hundreds of millions of childhoods messed up, disturbed now. And in sub-Saharan Africa alone, UNICEF estimates that over 79 million girls and women have experienced rape or SA during childhood. Behind those numbers is something even more important than the statistics themselves. The reality that most of these cases do not involve strangers, people who are already close to the child, people who had existing access to them, people who were already inside the environment of trust. And that is what makes this issue so difficult to notice early, because it rarely begins with something obvious. It begins with normalization, with trust, with blurred boundaries that develop slowly over time. And this is why turning kids into adults is not just a cultural issue, it is a safeguarding issue. Because when children are perceived as more mature than they are, they often receive less protection, less cautions from adults, less disbelief when something feels uncomfortable, but most importantly, less urgency when warning signs appear. And over time, that creates a very particular vulnerability, not because the child has changed in any way, but because the response to the child has changed. There's also another layer that people often overlook. Children who are praised for being mature are often gradually positioned into roles of responsibilities that are not appropriate for their age. They become emotional support system for adults. They become helpers, mediators, listeners. They learn to manage tension instead of expressing their own discomfort. And while that may look like strength from the outside, it often teaches a child to override their own internal signals, to prioritize being useful over being safe. And that pattern does not stay in childhood. It often continues into adulthood, where being needed becomes confused with being loved, where emotional over-functioning becomes the default in relationships. And let's not forget where boundaries feel unnatural rather than protective. And perhaps the most difficult part of all of this is that many people do not recognize these dynamics while they are happening. They only recognize them later, when distance gives clarity, when adulthood reframes childhood memories. 20s when they realized they were not just mature for their age, like they were often placed in situations that required them to be. And maybe that is the real question underneath all of this. Not why a child seems so mature, but why that expectation was placed on them in the first place. Because children are not meant to impress adults or be impressive versions of adults. They are meant to be children, and that distinction matters more than we tend to realize.
Let me know in the comment section, because I really do read everything that's left, and I think people are going to have some really powerful stories and perspectives under this video, and I just love to learn from other people's experiences. And if you enjoyed conversations like this, deeper cultural commentary, identity, femininity, social analysis, you name it, please like and subscribe. I'll definitely be posting more content more content like this. And if you want to read the original think piece that inspired this video, it's on Substack. Hey, if you want to read the original think piece that actually inspired this video, I wrote it over on my Substack. It's a bit more reflective and personal compared to this video. So if you're interested, the link will be in the description below, or maybe I'll add it on the screen somewhere. However, yeah, that's all I have to say. I'll see you guys in my next video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and deuces. Ew.